We will now see using the client object model in practice. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a standard Visual C# console application, so not a solution for SharePoint this time. We will call it Web Creator, and before we can start working with the SharePoint data from this console application, we must reference the client object model assemblies. So for .NET applications, they reside in the ISAPI folder of the SharePoint root. So we go to Web Server Extensions, 14, ISAPI, and there we have 2 client DLLs for SharePoint. So we'll add those to our project as references, and then we can start adding some using statements. So we will add a using statement for Microsoft.SharePoint.client, and this will allow us to use the objects very easily within our code. The first one we will use is client context, and we'll call it client CTX. And in its constructor we will pass in the URL of our intranet site. Effectively we are building a reference to our intranet site, and this is how the client object model will know where to send its commands when we batch and execute them, and we will see that later in the demo. So we can instantiate a site object, and this is the equivalent of SP site objects on the server, although in the client it's literally just called site. And we can obtain a reference to the current site from the client context object. The next step is to load the site object, otherwise we won't have access to it. So we will load that site.rootWeb in actual fact. So we'll be loading the equivalent of an SP web object directly. We can then instantiate a web object, which in the client terminology is similar to the SP web object that you may have used on the server. We can set it equal to the site's root web property, very much like you would do in server-side code. So as you start coding with the client object model, you will see that it bears lots and lots of similarities with the server-side APIs. We can now create our web template collection and instantiate it, and set it equal to the return value of the getAvailableWebTemplates method call of the web object. So we declare and instantiate and populate it in one line of code there. We have provided incidentally the locale ID of 1033, which is US English. Again we call the load method to ensure this template object variable in the web template collection is actually loaded and available for us to use in our client code. We then call clientContext.executeQuery, and this initiates communication between the client object model and the SharePoint server. So those batch commands that we have previously written will be sent at that point. The return values will be given to us via JSON, and then we will be assured that we actually have access to the templates and the web template collection object. So we can iterate through that very straightforwardly. We can do a for each web template, which is another client object model type, and for each of those in the template collection, write out to the console its ID, and that can be useful, and also its name, so we can identify at a glance which template has which ID. And we'll also write out its title. So that's a very brief example of getting started with the client object model. We will add a read line statement so that we will pause the application at this point, so we can view the results of those write line statements. Very simply, I can press Ctrl plus F5 to run the solution. Now the console appears and the available web templates are written to our console. So we have a number of those. We have the STS team sites, MPS meeting workspaces and so forth. This was very simple code, and hopefully it will give you an idea of how at least to get started. But now we will do something a little more powerful and a little more complex. What we will do is create a new site on the server, but by using the client object model. So we will instantiate a new web creation information object called WebInfo, and we will start to set some of its properties. As I mentioned in the previous video, what we are really doing is gathering together a series of commands, and in this case the commands are really property setting commands. So we will set the description and we will set the title, for example, and all of those properties are being set in the client. And at some point we will contact the server and have this new web created based on those properties. We will set its URL, which is a required property for creating a new web. And as you'll be aware, if you create these on the server, that's very similar behaviour. So I must reiterate that working with the client object model is very similar to the server-side APIs. We'll set its language to 1033 again, which is the US English locale, and we will specify not to break the permissions inheritance from the parent site. So we will use the same permissions and users and groups and so forth. And we will set the web template, and this was really the point of the first part of the demo, to see what's available for us. So we will use a template that perhaps we haven't used before, which is a meeting place decision template. We will see the results of this when we run the solution. So now we have the web creation information object populated with the appropriate properties, and we can use that in the creation process. And very simply, we will call webs.add of an existing web object. And we'll pass in the web info, in this case the web creation info object, as a parameter to that method call. So that's a very familiar way of working with sites and webs and so forth, although we provide some additional objects such as web creation information that allows us to batch the properties together for use in the creation of the new site. When we have executed the query, we will then write out to the console that this new website was created, and that's all there is to it. So let's run this solution. After a few seconds, the console will tell us that the new web has been created, and so we can now go and browse directly to that site. We'll start Internet Explorer, and we created this new web as a subweb of the intranet root web. So we can go directly to the site's directory. There's our new decision site. We have our description of created by the client OM, and the site has been created and populated with its default lists. All in all, this is a very simple way of working, and hopefully a very familiar way as well. We have site objects and web objects that are the equivalent of SP site and SP web objects. And we can batch together these commands and call execute query so that our client object model contacts our server and our server implements those commands.